So this first question is about the SEC and wrestling. So let's read this fan question. This question comes from Justin Thomas, TM, and he asks, should the SEC join the collegiate wrestling scene? This is a really interesting question because, as you may know, college wrestling conferences are slightly different from football conferences in that the SEC, there's no SEC conference in wrestling. There is, however, one SEC team that's typically in football. They're in the SEC. That is not in the SEC in wrestling, but they are in another conference. Leave a comment down below if you know what that team is. I'll reveal the answer in a bit, but leave a comment below to let me know if you know which team that is. So let's get into this. The SEC teams, as you may know, Alabama, Auburn, Ole Miss, University of Texas, Texas A&M, Georgia, LSU, the University of Tennessee, Kentucky, Florida, Vanderbilt, Missouri. So those are, there are a couple more teams, but those are the big powerhouse teams of the SEC. So, fun fact, there used to be SEC wrestling. Justin Thomas, who asked this question, just to let you know, there used to be SEC wrestling. This is something that I didn't know, as a matter of fact, that when I looked into this a bit, I found some more information. So let's get into what killed SEC wrestling. There are two words I have for you that killed SEC wrestling. Title IX. Title IX is what annihilated, eliminated, completely canceled SEC wrestling. Now, what is Title IX? For those of you who don't know, Title IX came into effect many years back, and it deemed that every college has to have the same amount of men's scholarships as they do for women's scholarships for collegiate athletics. So this means if Penn State gives out 100 scholarships for athletes, now the number is more than that, much more, then that means that they have to give out for men's sports, 100 scholarships for men's sports. They have to give out 100 scholarships for women's sports. This topic is just, it really upsets me because when this came into effect, it killed many, many wrestling programs and many, many smaller men's sports, such as wrestling, which is obviously not as big as football. Killed wrestling programs, killed swimming programs, some lacrosse programs at these different colleges, some golf programs, which is very upsetting because the thing is, these football programs, the max number of scholarships they can give out is 85. So if Alabama gives out 85 football scholarships, now they have to find 85 women's scholarships to give out. And there aren't as many women's sports, just statistically speaking, as the men's sports. So the men's sports, the lower ones, kind of lose out. And this is where wrestling lost out. What happened is in the 1980s, this is really, really interesting stat. In the 1980s, there were 146 collegiate wrestling teams. Today, there are about 80 teams. Now that number is growing a bit, but this number was cut in half because of Title IX, and that's really, really upsetting. Now let's they're cutting programs left and right. Last year, of course, Eastern Michigan was nixed. You may know Perry, who wrestled there last year, 141 pounds, made a real statement at nationals. Well, he found out when he got home from national tournament that his program was no longer available next year, and he could transfer out. So sad. So let's get into a little bit of the history of the SEC wrestling, though, which I thought was pretty cool. So back in around the 50s through the 80s, there were some SEC wrestling teams. There was an Auburn wrestling team, which was one of the biggest, but there was Auburn, Louisiana, Florida, Kentucky, and Georgia. A lot of these lasted, the big SEC conference in wrestling was from the 70s to the 80s. And this was started in 1969 by what they call the Dean of Southern Wrestling. His name was Coach Arnold Swede Umbach and Tom Milkovich. So these two were really the fathers of SEC wrestling. And they they set out to expand their programs at Florida, Auburn, and show, just get some guys out there. So the major teams were Auburn, Louisiana, and as I said, but these teams, they did have programs. Now, how well did they do? That's another topic, which, they actually did decently well. From the time, the SEC produced 23 All-Americans in those years. Now, I'm going from the 70s to the 80s because that's when there was an actual Southeastern Athletic Conference. The SEC, there were actually, throughout those 10, 11 years, there were 23 All-Americans. How many NCAA champs? 0. Now, Auburn had a few on the outskirts of the years, but they weren't a part of the actual conference, just to make a little bit of an adjustment there. Now, the only team to host the national tournament, SEC team to host the national tournament, was Auburn, and they hosted the national tournament in 1971. So when you're looking through those national title sites and you see Auburn on there, you may be a bit confused, but this is pretty interesting. Now, the Auburn program lived on for 27 years. They tried to resurrect this program actually multiple times with donors who had said they would donate, upwards of $100,000, but the school said no. And why? Because of those two words I just said, Title IX. They didn't have the available scholarships to give to these wrestling programs as they did because the football programs are so massive. Auburn has, one of the biggest football programs in the country. When you think Texas A&M, University of Texas, Alabama, their football programs are so massive that it doesn't allow for growth in other sports, which is kind of upsetting. And it's not the football program's fault, it's Title IX's fault. So I want to see the SEC come back with a wrestling program. Imagine if Alabama had a wrestling program. How dominant they are in football, having back-to-back national championships, a few over the past 10 years. They're always in that hunt for a title. Imagine how good their wrestling team could be. These big schools, they have the money to put into the program. We've seen Missouri, which is a relatively newer team. They've made an impact on the wrestling community because they have a good football program. They have a big budget as far as the school goes. It makes a lot of money, and that they can put some of that into the wrestling program. So it's really disheartening that because of this Title IX, we don't get to see those SEC teams. But the one thing, I mentioned Missouri. They are the only team that's actually in the SEC as in football that has a wrestling program. So that's the answer to that trivia question. But let me know what you think of Title IX. Is it complete BS, or is there some legitimacy to it? I really want to know your answers because this is something that's really, really upsetting to me.